For my presentation and my extended essay, I decided to talk about the effects of technology and the rise of populism on freedom of expression in the United States and Brazil. So first, I thought it would be really important to define some key terms that I would need to know for my essay. The first one was populism, which a populist is a member of a political party claiming to represent the common people, especially often capitalized, a member of a U.S. political party formed in 1891 primarily to represent agrarian interests and to advocate the free coinage of silver and government control monopolies. And this was the definition that I found from Merriam-Webster. But The Guardian, in an article about populism, better explains what populism has morphed into today. Populism is an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and argues that politics should be an expression of the volonté générale, which is the general will of the people. Practically, populist politicians, however, almost always combine it with other ideologies, such as nativism on the right and socialism on the left, which is what brings into question populism today and how technology has played a huge role on the altering of populism. Next, I define freedom of expression and speech, which is defined as a principle that supports the freedom of an individual or a community to articulate their opinions and ideas without fear of retaliation, censorship, or legal sanction. For the purpose of this essay and presentation, I will consider freedom of speech protected by the government if it appears in some form of legal document that is recognized nationally. Both of these countries have a constitution, with each of their current established constitutions guaranteeing the right to freedom of expression and speech, and therefore I find the two comparable in this manner. The key distinctions to make once knowing these definitions is, first of all, that freedom of expression is all-encompassing and encompasses freedom of speech, and secondly, that populism is not inherently bad or good, rather just a mindset. However, we do see that when it is politicized and becomes a platform for our politicians in today's society to run on, then we do see some of the issues that have occurred as a result of populism, and this is again influenced by the technological aspect that I'll be talking about later. What's so interesting about the rise of populism is that up until a couple of years ago, the consensus among European elites on the left and right was that populism was inherently bad. So knowing now what we know, considering that the definition does not actually make populism a bad or good thing, I had to pose myself one key question that would help me answer why it's viewed in a negative light, or was viewed in a negative light. So the next question that I found it important to ask is what led to a rise in populism in the past decade and a half. Now, the time frame that I will be using is a decade and a half because this is a global politics essay, and therefore it needs to be within my lifetime. So that's just a quick point of clarification. But what I have found to lead to a rise in populism in the past decade and a half has been very interesting, because we see that these populist ideas started to grow in Europe, and they formed specifically in Germany and Spain, but that sort of traveled overseas, as we see that now the United States and Brazil both have that strong populist leader in power. For the United States in particular, it was a convergence of party ideals. We see that politics has shifted less from voting on the person that you think will best suit your needs as a constituent, and rather it has shifted towards voting on one key principal issue. For example, we see that on the right, they tend to pull more Christians and religious people who have a religious affiliation because of the key issue of abortion, where those on the left tend to pull the same people each year because of their policies on gun rights. The reason that the convergence of parties in the United States has led to populism being more of a fad, or something to the point where our own president could be accused of being a populist leader, is quite simple. Because when the two parties start to vote solely on one issue and therefore continue to perpetuate a cycle of only voting for the person in your party, we see that it's easier to pit people against each other. And so populism really thrives off this idea of someone running for the common person. And following the Obama administration, while he did try to pass policies that were for the common person, we saw that a large portion of America is actually the middle class, specifically the upper middle class, and therefore that group felt isolated, while Democrats were trying to focus specifically on helping the less affluent. And therefore, the Republican Party was more polarized as they were trying to help those who were more affluent. And so that middle class was really left up in the air, and populism was able to swoop in for the common man and essentially elect a populist president. So we see that those two parties converging and having people more polarized on either end of the spectrum really left that giant group of American voters for anyone to take. It just depended on the way that they marketed themselves, and populism happened to be the best way to do that. We see that populism was definitely something that was already on the rise in Europe, but the populism that we were seeing in Europe is actually very different from the type of populist leaders that have been sprouting up in the United States. The reason for this is because populist leaders in Europe were actually much more far leaning to the left, which meant that their platform tend to ran on a more socialist policy. But in the United States, considering that we are very ingrained with our capitalist values, it would have been very difficult for a left-leaning populist to win. So in the United States, we see that middle class that was able to start voting and being the main voter group to essentially win over is how more right-wing populist leaders have become in power. But what's really interesting is the way that this reverberated through other countries. Following the rise of a populist leader in the United States, we see that Brazil in particular, but Latin American countries in general, have also had a rise of the same type of populist leaders. And that's probably because Brazil was in a very similar economic detriment to the fear that was surrounding our economic state in the United States. So while the two are not necessarily comparable because one was in a much more devastating economic place than the other, Brazil had that same fear, which allowed for a populist leader to take place. And we see that it almost happened as if it was the American Revolution all over again, because when America started really pitching these ideas of independence, we saw the French Revolution followed suit, and then slave rebellions in Latin and Central America. And that's almost the same thing that happened with the rise of a populist movement, because Brazil's current president, Jair Bolsonaro, is almost compared to President Donald Trump as the Trump of the Amazons. So we see that for sure the populism in America has just been spreading and continuing to impact countries in Southern America and Central America. So the next part of my extended essay that I wanted to talk about, but I'm still trying to figure out where it actually fits, is the idea of technology contributing to a rise in populism, which is 100% seen in the United States, but I don't know if it has necessarily had the same effects in Brazil. So that's what I'm still looking into on that aspect. But as far as in the United States, we see that technology in general has greatly reformed the way that we think of politics, but specifically through populism, when it comes to that idea of challenging the elite and running on a platform made for the normal average man. Things that President Donald Trump has said have really had an effect on that. For example, his creation of the term fake news, and also this idea of not necessarily trusting your news sources, is very interesting because that is a very populist ideal paired with a political party sort of tactic that we've seen in other countries like Germany and Spain, where they had populist leaders who were running on a socialist platform. So all of that background knowledge basically brought me to the heart of my essay, which is how have American views on freedom of expression shifted as a result of the rise of populism? And the same thing in Brazil, obviously. So far, I've really tried to split my research up by country and look at Brazil separately from the United States because I don't want to lump them into the same category because obviously both political systems are quite different. In the United States, at least, as I was talking about with this idea of fake news, we see that freedom of speech has actually been encouraged and the use of our right to expression has been heightened on both ends of the spectrum. With protests, we see that there have been a great increase in them, specifically against our current president on the left, which has essentially felt like because our president is so open and so willing to express his opinions on whatever may occur within our political sphere, that the people should hold him accountable. And so when he, for example, tweets or publicly announces things that the left or those who tend to lean left are uncomfortable with, we see an immediate spike in protests. However, on the other end of the spectrum, we see that freedom of speech has almost been encouraged to a negative extent because protests on the left have been getting violent, and on the right, we see that freedom of expression has turned into the acceptance of hate crimes. We as an American people have been encouraged and felt emboldened and empowered by some of the things that have been said from our government to the point that we feel more comfortable saying and expressing opinions that may be discriminatory. So my final lingering questions are, is the change in the American perspective truly a result of populism, or are other key factors playing a hidden role, like the aspect of technology? And while both Brazil and the United States have right-leaning populist leaders, have the same effects been seen following the election of right-wing populist leaders as in countries with left-wing ones? And finally, besides the current presidents in both countries, are there other significant politicians and leaders who run on a populist platform in these two countries? So finally, a quick reflection on the work that I've done so far and progress moving forward. I wonder how the element of technology will fit into my essay. I want to continue exploring that and making sure that it actually is relevant. I'm curious about other countries after having done in the research regarding global politics. If I were to add a third country, what country would it be, and is that even reasonable? And finally, how will I reference important dates that occurred prior to my time frame for the essay without placing too much of an emphasis on those events? So those are things that I've brainstormed with Ms. Gabbard and my supervisor, Mr. Sealand. So I will continue to do that. Finally, the number one way of knowing and areas of knowing that I feel like played a role in this were ethics and reasoning. Thank you.